somewhere like Sweden, which, despite having a reputation for being a liberal country, has some of the strictest drug laws in Europe, arguably the world. Annika Strandhäll is the minister in charge of drug policy.
Because, in Sweden we have a very broad political support in both the government and the parliament for our zero vision, as we call it in Sweden, a drug-free society.
At the heart of Swedish drug policy is this idea that cannabis is a gateway drug. Can you explain why you hold that policy so close?
We see, especially among young people, and also a lot of studies show that an extensive use of cannabis or regular use of cannabis at an early age also affect especially young people's brains. So that's why it's an important part in our drug policy and the way that we work to prevent the start or the gateway that cannabis is for many young people into heavier drugs.
Talking to people here in Sweden, there does seem to be a bit of a generational divide in that a lot of the older Swedes that we speak to seem to back the government and the government policy, but a lot of the younger Swedes have a much more liberal attitude when it comes to drugs. Do you see drug policy changing over here?
In Sweden we had quite liberal use of drugs and policies in the 60s and 70s, and we saw an increase of drug use in society as a whole. And of course the elderly Swedes know that we had this development in Sweden and also what it led to. We also have quite low levels of young people that use drugs regularly or even occasionally. So in that way our policies are successful, but we also have challenges, especially when it comes to the mortality rate if you are a more heavy drug user, and this is something that we are working on.
Whilst many Swedes I've spoken to agree with the government's strict drug policy, there are plenty that don't. Alexander Bard is a bit of a celebrity here, a former musician and now a judge on Sweden's Got Talent. He's also passionate about changing the law on drugs.
Essentially why Sweden was the Saudi Arabia of drugs, which it has been until recently in Europe, was because in Sweden we had this idea that we'd have a government, it could be socialist or conservative, didn't matter, but the government would actually sponsor an aggressive anti-drugs policy. And suddenly Sweden is at least the country in Europe where drug policy and culture surrounding drugs is changing the fastest at the moment.
Because we've come here because people say, oh, it's the strictest country in Europe. But your argument is it might be strict from the politicians and the people putting the laws in place.
Yeah.
But lots of young people are moving away from that and their attitudes are changing.
Oh, totally, totally. I mean, policy in Sweden and the aggressive anti-drug stance here is kind of an anomaly in Swedish culture. Sweden is incredibly liberal about sex, for example. So this aggressive conservative stance concerning drugs is kind of an anomaly in Swedish policy.
Swedish drug policy has always been about this idea of the gateway drug, and cannabis was seen as this gateway drug. It was the kind of, it's all your drug policy is based around this philosophy.
Yeah.
And lots of people still believe that to be the case. We've spoken to the head of police who's tackling narcotics. We've spoken to the MPs. All these people say that's still the case.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's different then?
Well, it turned out it was a lie. That's frankly not true. It's not empirically true. That's not how it works. And ironically, some people start with LSD and then they smoke cannabis.
If I come back in 5 years' time, will it be completely different? Will it be a legalized liberal system?
We have to start differentiating between drugs that are recreational use and are not addictive. They're one category. But then we have the other category, which is incredibly addictive drugs that are destructive for you and make you dysfunctional as a human being. And I don't see that we're going to legalize those drugs in a long time. Rather, we're going to have a much more advanced and civilized debate on how we deal with addiction per se. And I think Sweden could definitely go at the forefront of that movement.
Later that evening, I found two friends in a bar who have very different views on cannabis, so I jumped in for a chat.
It's like with alcohol. I think that it should be as prohibited as with alcohol. I don't see the difference between it.
Because your off licence is a government regulated,
yes,
aren't they?
Yes.
And that's how you'd like to treat weed?
Yeah, I think so.
You can have a beer or a glass of wine or anything, or the pairing with food and wine or beer, but when it comes to drugs, it's just drugs.
And you think they should just be banned, and that's the easiest way to deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But you don't.
But is that really like the solution to that? It's a generation question, actually. I think a lot of like the younger ones, they smoke more. Like
Have you ever smoked a joint?
yes, I have.
But you wouldn't do it in front of her because you
Yeah.
jeopardise your friendship.
No. I know she loves me anyway.
The Swedish